Hi, this is Jeremy of Blue Jeff Review. So there's been a lot of discussion recently about game companies having to lock their frame rate to 30 frames per second on consoles. And the reason that two of these companies gave, Ubisoft and Ready at Dawn Studios, is that 30 FPS has a more so-called cinematic aesthetic than 60 FPS. And because of that, a lot of gamers are not satisfied with this answer and they called bullshit on that, including TotalBiscuit. They claim that it's covering up the excuse that the current generation of console hardware is unable to run the game at 60 FPS. Now, while I can understand that hardware limitation is a legitimate reason to reduce the frame rate, is this justification or cinematic aesthetic for a lower frame rate completely without merit? Now, before I give you my opinion, it's important to know that I'm generally more of a movies person than a hardcore gamer. So my perspective on 30 FPS as an aesthetic choice may very well be a little bit different from what most gamers think. For me, you might not like my answer completely, but I actually think that given certain conditions, 30 FPS can give a cinematic look to games. But before you start shooting arrows at me, let me explain. TotalBiscuit has touched on this issue before on his video called The Great Frame Rate Non-Debate, as well as his recent content patch talking about Ubisoft saying that 30 FPS has a more cinematic feel. I'll link both videos in the description below so that you can listen and judge for yourself. In his first video, TotalBiscuit has made it very clear that he strongly thinks that 60 FPS undeniably provides a better experience for gamers, especially games with real-time 3D rendering. And that is absolutely true. But he also mentioned that South Park, The Stick of Truth, only ran at 30 FPS and he was okay with it because the game is trying to recreate a look that resembles the TV show. And here's the exact point that I'm trying to make, that TB has said so himself. In that very instance, 30 FPS is an aesthetic choice that suits the game's visual style because TV animation is in 30 FPS. Now let's talk about what Ready at Dawn Studios said about developing the Order 66 and why they chose 30 FPS. So I quote, 60 FPS is really responsive and really cool. I enjoy playing games with 60 FPS, but for one thing that really changes is the aesthetic of the game in 60 FPS. We're going for this filmic look, so one thing we knew immediately was films run at 24 FPS. We are going to run it at 30 because 24 FPS does not feel good to play. So there's one concession in terms of making it aesthetically pleasing because it just has to feel good to play. If you push that to 60 and you want it to look the way we do, it actually will end up looking like something on a Discovery Channel, like an HD TV kind of segment or a sci-fi original movie maybe, which doesn't quite have that kind of look and texture that we want from a movie. The escapism you get from a cinematic film image is just totally different than what you will get from television framing, so that was something we took into consideration. So that was what Dana Jen from Ready at Dawn Studios said about this. Bear in mind that the Order 1886 is also in a cinematic aspect ratio of 235, which is the kind of aspect ratio you will see from most big Hollywood movies. So this means that you will see black bars on the top and bottom on a normal HD TV screen. Now in the case of the Order 8086, you can say that the 235 aspect ratio and the 30 FPS is because of the limitation of the PlayStation 4 hardware. Apart from lowering the frame rate, the 235 aspect ratio also means that there's less pixels to render, and hence you can argue that what he said is bullshit. But at the same time, I actually don't think that the reasons he gave for that low frame rate and cinematic aspect ratio is not entirely untrue. If you think about it, with the 235 picture, right, and 30 FPS frame rate, and if you dim the lights, it can really feel like you're not just watching a movie but you're playing in one. And besides, 30 FPS, at least for me and most normal gamers that I know, is not really unplayable. I don't know, this can get a little bit subjective as to what frame rate you consider as minimum to be playable. For me, 30 FPS is minimum, optimal is 60. But for a gamer who is or was in competitive esports like TotalBiscuit, 60 FPS is minimum, optimal is 120 because TV has a 120Hz monitor. So going back to what Ready at Dawn said about the 30 FPS, I feel that it could have been handled a little bit better. So instead of saying, oh, we chose 30 FPS because it's more cinematic looking, I feel that it could have been a bit more honest and say that yes, we chose to at a lower frame rate at a 235 aspect ratio. It's indeed because of hardware limitation, but at the same time, with that reduced workload, we can input more graphical detail into it, like more effects and stuff. And we also hope, and you can add the point that we also hope that you enjoy this 30 FPS as a cinematic experience like what you see from a movie. Because we also strongly feel that 30 FPS also has a certain cinematic feel when it comes to gaming as well. That may get lost in when you run it at 60 FPS. So if I'm a PR guy, I'll probably say something like that. Look, the way I see this frame rate debate is a bit like black and white movies versus color. Color objectively looks nicer than black and white movies from a technical perspective, no doubt. But sometimes black and white can give a film noir feel to certain movies that is hard to achieve with full color. Remember that LA Noire gave you the option to play the game in black and white? Although, to be honest, the lighting isn't really great enough to look like film noir, but at least the option is there. Now, with all that said, I don't think that this aesthetic is a valid reason to force PC games with 3D rendering to run only at 30 FPS. Rather, it should be a choice in the option menu to lock the frame rate at 30 FPS if the gamer so desires. Why? Because the PC is capable of better hardware performance than consoles, and if your PC is powerful enough, you have the options to run games at 60 FPS or higher. With consoles, it's understandable to lock the frame rate because the hardware is fixed and limited. So when I heard rumors that Ubisoft is pressured by Microsoft or Sony to cap PC games at 30 FPS, I feel that is not acceptable. PC games want to make full use of the hardware that they spend a lot of money on to make their games look as beautiful as possible, as well as to get it to run smoothly. And with this false limitation by the developers, of course they'll be unhappy. As a PC developer, if Ubisoft really wants to push the 30 FPS aesthetic even on PC, they should have it in the options menu to lock the frame rate to 30 FPS, just like what Naughty Dog did for The Last of Us Remastered on PS4. Their game ran at 1080p 60 FPS on the console, but they have an option to lock the frame rate to 30 FPS, actually primarily to give a consistent response to the controls, but you also have the option if you want to see the game at a frame rate which you may like to call cinematic. Which brings me to the factor of controller response. If you want to lock the frame rate to 30 FPS on console, that's fine. But one, you have to make sure that the controller latency is as low as possible to give a smooth response. And two, make sure you optimize the frame rate to run as consistently as possible. Because if the frame rate drops below 30, the controls will definitely become slower and have a less consistent response, and it will not be fun to play. But just so you know, when it comes to PC gaming, frame rate is directly proportional to the speed of the controller response. So if PC have the option to play the game at a higher frame rate, they should not be deprived of that option, because higher frame rates definitely plays better and feels better than running at a lower frame rate. Alright, that's what I have to say for this now, so thanks for watching and have a good one.